Hello and welcome. So this is introduction to the combat beta. So first thing I want to say is please keep an open mind about this because this is a beta. It's not what is going to be actually in the live game because they're going to still make changes as it goes. So first thing you want to do is go to your graphics settings and lower it to minimum or whatever you're comfortable with. Because when you log in, there's going to be a lot of people. A lot of people means a lot of lag. So once you've logged in, you want to import save. Import save is on the bottom left. And you want to import save because if you don't, you'll start on a level 3 count. So once you've imported save, log in. And if you get a message saying it did not work, it's probably because there's so many people trying it at the same time. So just either keep trying again or come back in a few hours when there's not so many people on. And when you log in, you'll start out in lumbridge. There's a bunch of NPCs here. There's like 6 or 7. You get free weapons and armor from them, so feel free to browse. And above your chat box is an action bar. There's 12 slots to it. You drag pretty much anything into here, and you can bind a hotkey to activate whatever is in the slot. And if you want to throw something away, just drag the picture into the little trash can icon here, or click on this lock to lock your action bar from further changes. So I want to go over a few things you want to know about the beta. First, there's ability freedom. It's a basic ability. It requires 34 defense. It has a 15-second cooldown. It's basically an anti-stun and anti-bleed effect for 6 seconds, which is something you really need if you're ever going to do PvP. Imbued rings. Berserker ring gives a higher crit chance than Onyx ring. I guess they're trying to make Dagannoth Kings actually worthwhile to do now. Spirit Shields. Divine, Ellie, and Arcane will now have the absorption ability as a Divine. Spectral is left out. It's classed with the God War shields, so it's Bandos, Arma, and a Spectral shield. Rocktails. They'll now heal 1860 if you have the appropriate levels for it. Bruce will now only heal 5% HP. That's about 500 if you're in max life point gear. And in the beta, you could use Overload in the Wilderness. It is multi-way combat everywhere in the Wilderness. Any kind of poison weapons are now removed. If you had anything poison, it will show as unpoisoned in your bank. Crossbows and bolts. Crossbows now can only shoot up to a certain level of bolts. So now rune crossbows cannot shoot up to dragon bolts, and the same with dragon crossbow. But that means that there is this giant gap between a dragon crossbow and a chaotic crossbow. So they're looking into this problem. And later I'll talk about how wearing mage armor is better than wearing melee armor in a melee fight. Now to my suggested setup. So this is for a weapon and shield. Anything with a shield focuses mostly on defense. And there is just too many abilities to fit into one bar, so I have my ability book open to my ultimates, which is Immortality and Rejuvenate, as well as Debilitate, which is on the bottom. So I just want to go through this fairly quick. I'll be showing this in combat later in the video, but for now I just want to go quickly through all the setups. And you can see I'm wearing a offhand Excalibur. Well, it's just a normal Excalibur. It's just wielded in the offhand. It has the same stats of a whip, but they, for some reason, couldn't put offhand whip in, so they put this in. So this setup focuses mostly on offense. It has really good hits with your abilities because the damage output is based on the stats of your weapon. Also, I still have my ability book open because Debilitate does not require a shield to activate, and it offers a 50% damage reduction from your target. And with this setup, I have a few AoE attacks, which is area effect, which is not too useful in PvM, but useful in PvP situation. Now for a range setup. This is a shield and a bow. It focuses mostly on defense. I gotta have my ability book open for when I do ultimates. I just switch to it when I need to do something on it. So as with all my setups, I have a freedom for the first one because freedom in every PvP situation is practically needed. There's some uses in PvM like at next, but that's just about it. Then for my dual wielding setup, I have, well, there's not much range abilities, so I put it in some defensive one. And I have 2 ultimates at the end because you could just, it's possible to get up to full adrenaline bar before your ultimate cooldown has cooled down. So in most situations, you're going to need 2 ultimates that you're going to switch between with whatever setup you're going to use. So for the two-handed range setup, there isn't that much difference from the dual wielding setup. The only difference is there's maybe one ability that is two-handed rather than dual wielded, and the ultimate is different. The dual wielded has a higher damage potential, but then it could easily be dodged if the opponent just moves, which is bad in PvP situations. The only way this would work would be if they were stunned. So for two-handed range weapon, it is just single target ultimate ability. So for this setup, it is a one-handed mage weapon and a shield. Now for mage, there is not really that much abilities that you can use. There are a few that you can add in, but with even the defensive abilities, you'll find that you will have times where you're just waiting for the bar to cool down. But that does not mean that mage is underpowered. Asphyxiate, which actually does not require a mage weapon, is still very strong. This setup is for dual wielding mage weapons. Since there is not an offhand wand, they have books for it. So for example, in the gear I have on, I'm using a Virtus book. And by wearing the book, you cast twice as fast, but your damage output per spell is reduced to 50 to 70% of your max hit. Overall, this is a better damage output than using a two-handed mage weapon, but this costs twice as much runes to use. And for the last setup is a two-handed mage setup. Now there doesn't seem to be any specific mage abilities specific to dual wielding or two-handed, which is kind of weird because all the other styles do. So this is really similar to, actually it's the same as the previous one. The only difference is I moved the basic abilities to the left and thresholds in the middle and ultimates to the end. So for the previous setups, you can swap out abilities with whatever you feel comfortable with. If you're going to swap out some defensive abilities in, you can bring Debilitate. It's a defensive ability that offers a 50% damage reduction from your target. So now for counters. The first one you want to know is Freedom. It's very useful in PvP situations. It will free you from stuns as well as break bleed effects. Another useful ability is Anticipation. It is an anti-stun for 10 seconds, but it cannot be used when you're stunned, it has to be used before. This may be changed later on. Now for stuns. Stuns are useful to stun your target, but it is also useful to stop your opponent from comboing you using channeled abilities as well as ultimates, such as the ultimate Unload, the channeled ability Assault, as well as many others. So for this clip, I'm going to demonstrate what happens with bleed effects such as Slaughter. Slaughter is a threshold ability. It usually hits around 300 or 400s, but if you move, it'll triple the damage to around 900 or 1200. But of course, to counter this, just use Freedom and it'll break the bleed effect. Range also has a bleed effect attack, but it's called Fragmentation, but it's a basic ability. It's very powerful, especially if your target moves. But of course, the easiest way to defend against this is to use Freedom. It'll stop the bleed effects as well as make you immune to stuns. Now for people who wear shields, they have a very nice ability called Resonant. It will heal the attack you get hit by within 6 seconds of activation. This ability is very useful if you use it right when your opponent uses his ultimate. For rangers who are dual wielding, they have a very powerful range attack that hits a percentage of their HP for 4 times over 6 seconds. The attack unload is very powerful, but it is also very easy to dodge. You just have to move away from where you were, and it stops the attack. If you're a mage, you want to stay far away from the ranger, because if they get you hit by fragmentation, it will hit a lot of damage, along with their other attacks. So here's a demonstration of a fight where I'm using a weapon and a shield. So at the start of the fight, I use Anticipation so that he cannot stun me, because in the beginning you want to get to your thresholds really quick because that's where you get your KO power. And if your opponent gets to your thresholds first, then you gotta worry about eating because then either one of you could deal a lot of damage. So I use my channeled ability Assault, which deals damage over like 6 seconds, but my opponent stuns me, which stops my attack. So I use my freedom to break out of my stun, then I stun him, but he uses his freedom to break out of my stun as well. So now we both do not have any protection from bleed effect. So I use Slaughter on him, knowing that he cannot protect from the bleed, and then followed by Reflect for extra damage dealt. So with a combination of my Slaughter and Reflect, he's getting dealt over 1000 damage per second. So I go in with my ultimate that deals 25% off his maximum HP, but that is not needed because my Deflect kills him. So in this example, I'm using Super Potty using Overload, Torva, and Chaotic Maul. I'm using Defensive Shield, and we both slaughter each other. I use my ultimate for 25% of his HP, and finish it off with a kick. So for a defensive melee setup, I like to go from Slaughter to Reflect to my ultimate. It's very good against people who use chaotic mauls. So in the previous example, the most damage you got was from defensive abilities like Reflect, where you reflect damage back at your opponent. So for a dual wielding setup, most of your damage is in your threshold and your ultimates. Mostly your ultimate, but your thresholds build up to your ultimate. So once you have your ultimate, well, you don't need your ultimate, but it helps. You can go for a combo with Assault to Slaughter to Flurry to your ultimate. Now, Assault isn't needed. I don't use it that often just because it takes a little while to set up because you need a whole 6 seconds of uninterrupted combat to add it in. So with Flurry, it is a very powerful ultimate. It goes on for 10 seconds, so even after the initial hits, it's still gonna keep on hitting for 20% of your opponent's life points. So with a Slaughter to Flurry to ultimate combo, this is a very hard combo to eat out of, assuming that the hits actually hit rather than hit zeros. As for the previous setup, most of your damage came from ultimate ability, but for mauls and two-handed weapons, most of your damage output is from thresholds, such as Slaughter, Hurricane. Assault is kind of useful, but it just takes too long to set up. If you want to use it before you plan to use Slaughter. So here I went in for the kill. I used Slaughter followed by Hurricane, which is very powerful, especially with two-handed weapons. And this was all in the course of 2 seconds. So you can kind of tell how powerful this actually is. The downside is you're gonna really get wrecked if you try and do this on somebody who has Reflect active. So as I said earlier, most of your damage is from thresholds, and ultimates don't really help that often. So I would say stick to thresholds, like don't even use your ultimate unless you think you can get the kill with it. Now with range, you want to focus on two things. Your fragmentation, which is your bleed effect. It's a basic ability, but then they still can protect against it if they use freedom. So before you go for the kill, you want to use your stun, your binding shot attack, which stuns them. And if you use your freedom to break out of it, you can use your fragmentation right after that for a combo. So when you see your opponent go in for the kill with maybe a slaughter, you want to use reflect. It'll deflect a lot of damage back, which adds to your damage output, which is how you turn your weakness into your advantage. And you can add in extra damage if you do maybe a stun or if you use fragmentation along with this. So I only have one example of these because it was just so hard to get a good kill. But do keep in mind that I am at a very big disadvantage because they're using overload, I'm using normal pots. They're using melee, I'm using range, which is melee is supposed to be better than range. So now onto dual wielding crossbows. Now I tried rune crossbow for a very long time against melee and I just could not get a kill, so I switched to chaotic crossbows. So I go for fragmentation off the bat because it does a whole lot of damage, and since they're melee, they have to run up to you. I'm constantly moving around because it keeps them disoriented. It makes it harder for them to see what's going on, but it might not be something you would do in PvP because maybe the other person might not just fight you. But in this case where it's just one on one and we have to fight each other, it's easier for me because I'm controlling the situation. I'm the one that he has to chase since he is melee distance and I'm range. So here I almost got him with my spec, but then he walked up to me, so my spec stopped. And I got him down to what he was earlier because when he was specking me out, I shot a fragmentation in there and started moving around, causing extra damage to him, lowering his HP in preparation for my ult. And he didn't seem to notice since most of the fight I was running around, so it just seemed like I was still just running around again. So now I got him stunned, and he knows that if he used freedom to break away, I'll be able to use fragmentation and for sure be able to get my extra damage on him. So then I use my threshold rapid fire, which looks like my ultimate. It shoots 4 attacks over 6 seconds, but is not as powerful as my ultimate, but it does look like it. Once he is unstunned, I use my rapid fire. It looks like my ultimate, and then right after I do that, I use my actual ultimate. And using it back to back is very powerful. And with the initial damage, it is hard to react to this, even at around half HP. So for the 2H range setup, your ultimates aren't that strong and your thresholds aren't overly powerful, but you can still make do with fragmentation and stuns. Since your damage output for fragmentation is based on your weapon damage, it works really well with two-handed crossbows such as a Zarya bow or maybe a royal crossbow. It'll still hit fairly well. I added a provoke ability in there because it's just with there's so few range abilities that there are times where you just have nothing else to use and you don't want to use freedom because that is a just in case if you get bleeds or stunned. And provoke has a fairly short cooldown of like 10 seconds, so it isn't that big of a problem to use. So for this kill, I did a combination of fragmentation and incendiary shot. Incendiary shot deals a percentage of the opponent's HP. In PvP, it's like 2000 or 3000 damage. It depends on what they're wearing. But there is a small delay when you shoot it. It takes about 3 seconds for it to explode. For this kill, it was a combination of fragmentation and stun. My opponent had immunity to stun so that if I tried to stun him, it would instead hit 300% of my weapon damage, which killed him. So now for Mage. Mage on Rangers, you will splash like non-stop. It is so hard to kill him. If you're fighting a Ranger and you're maging, just like leave. It will take you forever to kill him. But there is a small chance you gotta time it right. If you have a shield, you gotta focus on defensive abilities. You gotta focus on Reflect, that will deal damage back to them on whatever they hit on you. And if you can, use it when they do their ultimate. Asphyxiate and Reflect are about the most useful abilities you can have for a mage defensive setup. Asphyxiate is very accurate. It'll hit maybe 1,000. It hit 4 times over 6 seconds, and it's fairly accurate. Even if you're in full Torva, you'll still maybe hit, even on X. And with a combination with Reflect, it can deal massive damage. Like, here's an example. So I use Reflect right before my opponent uses his ultimate ability. He uses Deadshot on me, which hits multiple hits over a period of time, which is a blade effect. Just as I'm using Asphyxiate, which is a very accurate mage attack, and just as I'm about to pull out the third or fourth hit, I go in with Wild Magic and go for my ultimate ability. And for the last one, I have Magic with Two-Handed. You don't cast as fast, but yeah, I don't really see the advantage of this. It's a little more cost effective, I guess, if you want to wait a little bit longer. Your spells aren't that much powerful, but it's also very hard to kill the other person. With Magic, you gotta focus mostly on stunts with, like, maybe Ice Barrage. So far, a Storm of Armor isn't that great because Armadillo Battle Staff is considered a melee weapon, so your accuracy is lowered as well as it doesn't speed it up so far in the beta. So for the most part, you're gonna splash a lot, but then Asphyxiate and Wild Magic is probably your best bet because Asphyxiate is very strong. It hits 4 times and it's really accurate even on Pernix. Around the third or fourth asphyxiate hit, you want to use Wild Magic, because there is a delay. So for this go, we were actually both out of food, so the only thing that saved me was Asphyxiate. It stunned him, as well as doing fairly good amount of damage, and I followed it up with Wild Magic. Okay, so the part about where wearing mage armor is better if you're in a melee fight, this is because, well, it might not be better, but you have better defense. That's because mage is supposed to be better than melee. So to enforce the combat triangle, they have made it so that mage has really good melee defense, better than wearing Torva. So if you're in Virtus, you have better melee defense than Torva. But this also means that they have added in a negative effect, so like it's like in Daemonheim. If you're trying to melee with mage gear on, there's a negative attack accuracy on it. Now you can't see this, but the effect is there, or it should be there. This is according to a JMod post. So I want to give a huge thanks to my friend. He's the guy who needs a map. He helped with a lot of getting the clips for the video. So thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.